Is this a joke, Astrid? Zinnia's voice cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched the notarized bank records while the velvet box lay discarded on the floor. We are your parents. You can't sue us for family loyalty? It wasn't loyalty, Mother. It was a heist, I replied, my gaze as cold as the legal ink on the pages. You declared me dead to steal my trust. Now I'm the one closing the books. Cyprian's glass shattered on the marble, the sound echoing like a gavel. The scene dissolved, rewinding to the silent, suffocating perfection of the evening's beginning, when the air was first poisoned by a cloying, floral mask. The scent of expensive white lilies hung heavy in the foyer, a cloying sweetness that attempted to mask the smell of old wax and even older secrets. I stood by the grand mahogany staircase of the Greenwich mansion, adjusting a centerpiece with practiced precision. Outside, the twilight of a Connecticut autumn was bleeding into a deep, bruised purple, but inside, the house was a hive of artificial warmth. My parents' 30th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration of endurance, yet as I smoothed the linen tablecloths, I felt like a ghost haunting my own childhood home. To my left, my older brother, Lazarus, lounged on the velvet sofa, a crystal tumbler of scotch resting on his knee. He didn't offer to help. He never did. He was the family's golden investment, the one who was always just about to make it big, while I was the quiet one, the youngest, the risk analyst who dealt in the cold reality of numbers. Genuineness isn't found in the noise of a celebration, but in the quiet sacrifices no one sees. I chose to stay and help not out of a lack of ambition, but because I still valued the dignity of the home my grandmother had built with her own hands. I didn't argue. I simply reached up and adjusted my collar, my knuckles white but my face a mask of calm. I had learned long ago that forgiveness isn't about giving someone a pass. It's about not letting their bitterness consume your own peace. I'll change in a moment, Mother, I said softly, my voice steady despite the familiar sting. I watched her turn away to charm a waiter, her laughter light and hollow. It's funny how we spend our lives craving the approval of people who are too busy looking in the mirror to ever truly see us. I retreated toward the kitchen to check the wine list, but my phone vibrated against the cool marble of the countertop. It was a sharp, clinical interruption to the evening's theater. I opened a private email from my insurance provider, expecting a routine update on the health plan upgrade I'd applied for last week. Instead, the bold red letters of the subject line made my heart skip a beat. Application denied, pre-existing terminal condition. My breath hitched. My mind, trained to spot anomalies in high-stakes financial data, went into overdrive. I hadn't filed a claim for a terminal illness. I hadn't even been to the doctor in a year. I scrolled down, my eyes darting across the digital trail of my own identity. There it was, a series of disability benefit claims filed under my Social Security number, linked to a clinical history I didn't recognize. The payout addresses were masked through a shell company, but the IP logs pointed directly back to this house. Zinnia had used my medical identity to subsidize their luxury. They hadn't just stolen my credit, they had stolen my health on paper, labeling me a dying woman to keep their lifestyle afloat. I looked through the doorway at my parents laughing with the first arriving guests. A profound sense of pity washed over me, heavier than any rage. True wealth is a clear conscience, and by that metric, this mansion was the poorest place on earth. My silence had been a shield for them for years, but now the cage was finally ready to open. The dinner bell rang, a silver chime that sounded like a funeral knell to my ears. We sat at the long oak table, surrounded by the elite of Greenwich. My father, Cyprian, stood up, raising a vintage Bordeaux to the light. To family loyalty, he declared, his voice booming with a hollow authority. To the bonds that can never be broken. I held my water glass with a hand that didn't shake, the only person at the table not drinking the poison they called tradition. Under Connecticut law, identity theft within a family is a felony, but I wasn't ready to call the police. Not yet. My moral compass demanded I give them one last, silent chance to be honest, even if I knew they wouldn't take it. Have you ever looked at the people who raised you and realized you were seeing them for the first time? It's a lonely kind of clarity. I excused myself before the main course was served, slipping away into the quiet shadows of the library. I sat at my grandfather's old desk, the scent of leather and dust a small comfort. I opened my laptop and created a new file, titling it simply, Accountability. You cannot fix a house where the foundation is made of lies. You can only choose to stand on solid ground. As I searched for a pen to jot down a timeline, I pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume of Emerson from the shelf. A yellowed, unopened envelope fell out from between the pages. It was addressed to me, in my grandmother's elegant, spindly handwriting. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. The ink was faded, but the first line hit me like a physical blow. Astrid, my dearest, if you are reading this, it means they have finally told you the truth about the trust, or they are still hiding the fact that you own the very ground they walk on. My eyes widened, the breath leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. I realized my name wasn't the only thing they had buried. The weight of the yellowed envelope in my hand felt heavier than the entire library surrounding me. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic reminder that while my family had declared me dead on some cold, bureaucratic ledger, my heart still beat with the fire of the living. I stared at my grandmother's elegant script, the ink a silent witness to a truth they had tried to cremate. I wasn't just a daughter they tolerated. I was the owner of the very ground they occupied. The accountability file on my laptop screen blinked at me, a digital eye demanding action. 2 days later, the Greenwich morning arrived with a biting chill that mirrored the frost settling in my chest. I spent the early hours moving through leasing offices across town, my heels clicking sharply against polished marble floors. Each time, the result was the same. A polite smile from a leasing agent, a brief tap on a keyboard, and then a confused frown. I'm sorry, Astrid, but there's an unusual flag on your credit report. A medical lien? I thanked them calmly and walked out, the pattern as clear to me as a fraudulent spreadsheet. They were bottlenecking my independence, ensuring every exit I tried to take led back to a door they controlled. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Zinnia's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Astrid, darling. Her voice was like warm honey poured over broken glass. I heard you've been having a dreadful time with those apartment hunts. It's so unfair how the world treats young women these days. I didn't point out that the world hadn't sabotaged me. She had. Look, she continued, Cyprian and I discussed it. We have that lovely unit in the Fairfield building. It's private, secure, and we've already cleared the paperwork. It's the least we can do to make up for all this anniversary stress. Kindness given with strings attached isn't a gift, it's a leash. I knew the trap was set, but sometimes the only way to dismantle a machine is to step inside it. I agreed, my voice the perfect blend of weary gratitude. Before heading to the new place, I stopped at the small artisan cafe near my father's office. I bought a bag of the dark roast beans he loved, the ones that smelled of smoke and earth. I did it not because I owed him, but because I refused to let their corruption dictate my character. You don't lose your integrity just because others have discarded theirs. I would meet them with the courtesy of a daughter, even as I prepared the precision of an auditor. The Fairfield apartment was Instagram perfect. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the minimalist gray furniture and the scent of lemon-scented polish. It was a stage set for a life I was supposed to be grateful for. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence of the building ringing in my ears. It felt eerily cold, a sterile box designed to contain a person rather than host a soul. My risk analyst brain didn't see a home. It saw a controlled environment. I began my sweep. It was a habit born from years of military-grade security training, a quiet instinct that saved me when intuition wasn't enough. I started with the smoke detectors. Most people never look twice at them, but I knew they were the perfect housing for something more sinister. I pulled over a kitchen chair and reached up, my fingers brushing the ceiling molding. There, tucked into the shadow of a decorative groove, was a pinhole lens. Smaller than a grain of rice, but capable of transmitting every breath I took back to a server I didn't own. A cold, familiar sensation crawled up my spine. It wasn't fear. It was the icy clarity of total betrayal. My own parents were the landlords of this cage. They hadn't given me a home. They had given me a glass box. They wanted to monitor my phone calls, my professional files, the very moments I spent sleeping. Home is supposed to be where you take off your mask, not where they force you to wear one. I stood there, staring directly into the hidden lens. I didn't scream, I didn't rip it out. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a high-resolution photo of the serial number on the device's back. This was a Class D felony under Connecticut's privacy laws. They were handing me the rope they would eventually hang by, and they were doing it with a smile. I moved to the bedroom and found the second one. They weren't just curious, they were predatory. They were sell-side players in a market of my misery. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind already cataloging the legal precedents for unauthorized electronic surveillance in a residential lease. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a witness for the prosecution. For the next few hours, I played the part. I moved through the apartment, unpacking a few boxes, humming a tune I didn't feel. I acted for the camera, the ultimate performance of a daughter settling in. Meanwhile, my laptop was connected to an encrypted VPN, its screen shielded from the angle of the lens. I began linking the shell company that owned the Fairfield building to my father's offshore accounts. The trail was sloppy, hidden behind layers of mediocre accounting that I could peel back like sunburnt skin. I reflected on the nature of the fight I was in. The most powerful weapon against a lie is a life lived in the light, even when they try to dim it. I wouldn't descend into their madness or meet their shadows with my own. I would meet them with documentation. Every minute they watched me was another minute of evidence I would use to reclaim my grandmother's legacy. They thought they were the ones with the view, but they didn't realize I was the one holding the map. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood floor, my phone chimed. A text from Lazarus. Mom and Dad said you love the new place. Just wait until you see this surprise guest they've invited to the anniversary dinner. You're finally going to be taken care of, Astrid. For good. I looked at the message, then back at the hidden lens in the ceiling. A surprise guest. A forced resolution. I realized I wasn't just being watched. I was being prepared for a final transaction. I smiled. Not for the camera, but for myself. They thought they were inviting a lamb to a feast, but they had no idea they had just walked into the auditor's office. The night air in Greenwich was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and dormant earth. Rain drummed a relentless, noir-style rhythm against the roof of my car, a sound that felt like a countdown. I pulled into the shadows of the public library's parking lot, the dim yellow streetlights casting long, distorted reflections across the puddles. My heart hammered a hollow beat against my ribs, not from fear, but from the surreal weight of the folder sitting on the passenger seat. I wasn't just investigating a crime anymore. I was hunting for the remnants of my own life. Mylis was waiting in the corner of the reference section, her silver hair catching the low light of a desk lamp. She was the only person who had ever looked at me and seen a human being instead of a line item. When she slid the heavy, wax-sealed envelope across the mahogany table, her hand trembled slightly. Astrid, she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. Some truths are like glass. Once they break, you can never put the world back together the same way. I took the envelope, the coldness of the paper seeping into my fingertips. Inside was a death certificate. It was crisp, official, and utterly terrifying. It stated that Astrid Vesper had passed away in a small hospital in Oregon 3 years ago. The cause of death was listed as a respiratory failure following a long illness. My father's signature, Cyprian's elegant, arrogant scrawl, was right there at the bottom. He had legally murdered me on paper to bypass the age restrictions on my grandmother's trust fund. I sat in that silent library and pressed 2 fingers against the pulse in my neck. It was strong and steady, a biological protest against the bureaucratic lie. I wasn't just forgotten. I had been erased from the land of the living so they could buy another vintage car and pay for Lazarus's newest failed venture. The horror was deep, a cold blade through the soul, but it brought a diamond-hard clarity. Forgiveness doesn't mean staying for more abuse. It means releasing the hope that they will ever change. I reached across the table and squeezed Mylis's hand. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I simply thanked her for the truth, choosing to remain alive through my actions rather than their permission. Back in my heavily monitored apartment, I moved with the precision of an assassin. I sat in the blind spot I'd mapped out, a small corner behind the armchair where the miniature cameras couldn't reach. My laptop buzzed, its screen shielded. My fingers raced across the keyboard, plunging into the intricate web of shell companies and offshore money transfers Cyprian had used to disperse the trust funds. I was no longer just a girl. I was a risk analyst conducting the final audit of a toxic asset. The digital trail was foul. The money hadn't gone to family security. It had flowed into a secret secondary residence in Florida for Cyprian's other family. A secret life Zinnia likely didn't even know about. And the rest? It vanished into the black hole of Zinnia's private high-stakes gambling debts at offshore casinos. They had stripped my life to the bone to feed their vices. I felt a profound, weary pity for them. True wealth is a clear conscience, and they were bankrupt in every sense that mattered. I didn't seek revenge. I sought liquidation. I began using my remaining savings and the small inheritance from my grandmother's personal estate, the one they hadn't found yet, to buy up the private, high-interest debts my parents owed to third-party lenders. Under Connecticut's debt collection statutes, I was becoming their primary creditor. You don't fight a fire with more fire. You remove the oxygen that keeps it burning. I was slowly taking ownership of their lives, one delinquent payment at a time. I paused and looked at a faded Polaroid of my grandmother tucked into my keyboard. She was standing in the garden of the Greenwich mansion, her smile radiant and real. "I'm not doing this for rage, Grandma," I whispered into the cold air of the room. "I'm doing this to bring your house back to the light." I was no longer the victim of their story. I was the steward of the integrity they had discarded. The house was a mess of lies, and I was the only one with the courage to sweep them out. By midnight, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a sharp, biting clarity. I compiled the accountability folder, a physical and digital dossier containing the fake death certificate, the offshore wire transfers, and the legal notices of my new status as their creditor. I understood the federal fraud implications. I had enough evidence to send them both to a federal penitentiary for decades. But my goal wasn't a prison cell. It was a boundary they could never cross again. I wrote a single sentence in my private journal. A boundary is not a wall to keep people out. It is a gate to keep my peace in. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the auditor of their reckoning. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from the tension. I looked out the window at the dark Greenwich streets, feeling the weight of the upcoming anniversary party. It wouldn't be a celebration. It would be an execution of the lies they had lived by. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock shattered the silence. I didn't jump. I didn't panic. I simply closed my laptop and slid it under the chair. Zinnia walked in, her silk robe billowing behind her like a shroud. She carried a silver tray with 2 steaming cups of tea, her artificial, predatory smile firmly in place. "Astrid, darling, I saw your light was still on," she said, her voice dripping with maternal poison. "I thought you might need something to help you sleep." I watched her pour the tea, the steam rising between us like a veil. I knew every drop was seasoned with a lie I was no longer willing to swallow. She sat across from me, her eyes searching mine for a weakness that was no longer there. She thought she was still the puppet master, but she didn't realize I had already cut the strings. I took the cup she offered, the porcelain warm against my palms, and smiled back. The game was reaching its final act, and for the first time, I was the one holding the script. Zinnia poured the tea with the practiced elegance of a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of the superficial. Sunlight, filtered through the expensive linen drapes of my Greenwich apartment, caught the steam rising from the porcelain. As I watched her, my risk analyst training, the part of my brain that identifies microscopic anomalies in high-stakes data, triggered a silent alarm. On the amber surface of the liquid, a subtle, oily sheen shimmered unnaturally. It was a pharmacological signature I recognized from my time researching chemical liabilities. A sedative. No, something more specific. A clinical-grade disorienting agent. "You've been looking so peaked lately, Astrid," my mother said, her voice dripping with a warmth that felt like wet wool. She leaned in, her eyes wide with a performative concern that didn't reach her pupils. "Lazarus mentioned you seemed confused on the phone. These frightening memory lapses. We're all so worried." She pushed the cup toward me. I didn't touch it. I simply watched the way the light hit the tea, understanding the depth of the betrayal. They weren't just attempting to steal my inheritance anymore. They were systematically trying to dismantle my mind, I mimicked the symptoms they expected. I let my shoulders sag. I allowed my eyelids to droop, creating the illusion of a daughter fading under the weight of an invisible illness. True love nurtures the mind. It doesn't seek to imprison it. Even in the face of this cruelty, a pang of hollow pity resonated within me. It was tragic that my mother's only perceived path to security required the destruction of her own child. I played the part of the victim, knowing that by allowing her to believe the plan was working, I was securing the evidence needed for her reckoning. You can take my signature, and you can take my money, but the sanctuary of my mind belongs to me alone. The next morning, the scene shifted to a sterile, high-end clinic on the outskirts of the city. The air smelled of ozone and expensive floor wax. Cyprian stood by the window, his back to me, while Zinnia sat in a leather chair, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. They were presenting video evidence to a psychiatrist whose professional ethics appeared as flexible as his expensive suit. The footage was an edit of me from the previous night, stumbling slightly, my speech slurred by the drugs I had only pretended to ingest. They were filing for an emergency conservatorship. The legal term hung in the air like a noose. They aimed to have me declared incapacitated, a move that would legally strip me of every right I possessed. My trust funds, my corporate pension, my very ability to choose where I lived, all of it would fall under their control for life. I sat in the waiting room, my expression blank, while I listened to the muffled tones of their plea for help through the heavy office doors. During a moment when Zinnia left her bag unattended to use the powder room, I found the folder. It was tucked between her designer wallet and a bottle of expensive perfume. Inside were staged photographs. I saw pictures of my apartment looking like a hoarder's den, items I had never seen before, like piles of broken clocks and strange antique dolls, were scattered across my floor. They had used my own accounts to buy these oddities, planting them in my home while I was at work, to prove I had lost touch with reality. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Looking at the medical report, I felt the cold fire of a final detachment. A mother's arms are meant to be a refuge, not a straitjacket. By the time I returned to the apartment, the slow burn horror had sharpened into a lethal analytical recovery. I performed a systematic sweep of the rooms, moving with the cold efficiency of an auditor. I found the medication bottle hidden deep within Zinnia's favorite charity bag, which she had conveniently left behind. I photographed the labels, the batch numbers, and the pharmacological warnings. I linked every receipt of the insanity props they had purchased back to the credit cards they had opened in my name. Under U.S. federal law and Connecticut state statutes, a fraudulent conservatorship filing involving chemical restraint isn't just a family squabble. It's a severe criminal offense. I immediately secured a private, third-party blood test at an independent lab to prove my absolute sobriety. The results would be the ultimate counter-audit. I wasn't just building a defense, I was preparing an indictment. Justice is not about the weight of the blow, but the clarity of the truth. I decided to let them continue their theater, allowing them to dig their own grave deep enough to ensure they could never climb out. I needed one final piece of leverage. While Zinnia was busy coordinating with the psychiatrist, I accessed Cyprian's digital briefcase during one of his rare moments of technological negligence. I didn't find just more financial theft. I found a secret ledger, a document titled with the sterile coldness of a corporate merger. It wasn't an account of what they had spent. It was an invoice for my brother Lazarus's mounting debts to a dangerous private creditor in the city. My name was listed at the very top of the document, underlined in red ink. I am no longer their daughter or their ATM. I am a bargaining chip on a risky game I never wanted to be a part of. I am listed as living collateral. They are selling ownership of my life and future income to make way for their spoiled son. I sit in the dim light of the living room, the responsibility box on my lap like a weapon. The betrayal is complete. The foundations of the house have crumbled, and the only thing left is to ensure I am not the one crushed when it finally falls apart. The accountability box felt like a block of dry ice against my thighs, cold enough to burn, heavy enough to anchor me to the floor of my silent living room. I stared at the dark TV screen, watching my own silhouette. The foundation of the house was gone. The people who were supposed to be my protectors had evolved into architects of my demise. I knew the only way to avoid being crushed in the inevitable collapse was to step entirely outside the structure they had built. The weekend before the anniversary party arrived with a heavy, humid tension that blanketed Greenwich like a shroud. Cyprian invited me to an exclusive networking dinner at a private club downtown, a place where the mahogany was older than most countries, and the silence was bought with six-figure memberships. The air inside was thin, smelling of expensive cigars and the sterile scent of antique paper. As we walked through the foyer, my father's hand on my shoulder felt like a lead weight. I caught my reflection in a gilded mirror. Astrid looked composed, but my eyes were the eyes of a woman watching a predator from the brush. Across the table sat a man whose skin looked like weathered parchment, and whose eyes held the cold, transactional gaze of a repo agent. Cyprian didn't introduce him as a friend, but as a strategic partner. I sat through the meal, barely tasting the salt on the steak, as the conversation drifted toward future consolidations and unifying family legacies. My mind, sharp as a surgeon's blade, began to piece together the subtext. They weren't talking about business ventures. They were talking about me. I excused myself to the restroom, but doubled back to the shadow of the heavy drapes near my father's private booth. I heard the rasp of a fountain pen on paper and the low murmur of Cyprian's voice. She's the last piece of the puzzle, Julian. With her trust fund and her future income streams merged into the estate, Lazarus's debts will be settled in full. I felt a sudden, hollow ache in my chest. A father's job is to provide a foundation for his daughter to stand on, not a stage for him to sell her from. Cyprian had signed a master settlement agreement to erase his favored son's gambling debts and his own disastrous bad investments. He had promised to facilitate a legal merger of my life with this bankrupt associate. I was no longer an ATM. I was human collateral. I didn't lash out. I didn't burst through the curtains. I stood in the shadows, my heart rate steady, recording the final admissions of the trade on my phone. The bond was officially broken. I walked back to the table, sat down, and finished my wine with a hand that didn't shake. Have you ever realized that the person who gave you life is the same one trying to take it away? It's a moment that strips away every illusion you've ever held about love and leaves only the cold steel of survival. The counterstrike from my mother came less than 12 hours later. Zinnia didn't use a blade, she used a broadcast. By Sunday afternoon, my phone was a furnace of notifications. Using the delirium videos she had staged, the ones where I appeared incoherent due to the sedatives she had slipped into my tea, she had leaked a carefully edited, distressing clip to our entire social circle. She even sent it to my HR department at the firm, framed as a plea for medical intervention for a daughter in crisis. My professional reputation as a risk analyst, the very thing I had built with sweat and late nights, was being systematically dismantled. I received an urgent email from my boss. Astrid, we've seen the video. We need you to take an immediate leave of absence pending a full psychological evaluation. The walls were closing in. I was facing potential unemployment, social exile, and a legal trap. Zinnia called me, her voice a poisonous purr. It's for your own good, darling. You're clearly unwell. Let us take over the burden of your life. I felt the familiar pressure of confinement, the suffocating weight of being trapped in their story. But I remembered a truth my grandmother used to whisper when I was little. Character is like a tree, and reputation is like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of it, but the tree is what it really is. Zinnia was burning my shadow, but my tree stood firm, rooted in the truths I had spent months gathering. I wasn't panicking. I retreated to my self-identified blind spot in the apartment and opened my laptop. I contacted Milas. We had one final piece of the legal puzzle to verify. The clause in my grandmother's original trust that Cyprian thought he had erased with my fake death certificate. Milas confirmed it. The trust contained a clawback provision in case of fiduciary fraud. By legally killing me, Cyprian had inadvertently triggered a total liquidation of the family estate back to my grandmother's original charitable foundation, unless the living beneficiary, me, intervened. He had handed me the nuclear option without even knowing it. I prepared the legal response. A cease and desist regarding the social media defamation and a demand for accounting under Connecticut's trust laws. I realized I couldn't play the game by their rules anymore. I had to flip the board entirely. I looked at the anniversary gift box. The accountability gift. It was no longer a request for a conversation. It was a formal indictment. Sometimes the only way to save a family from itself is to let it face the consequences of its own choices. You cannot heal a wound that refuses to be cleaned. The final blow of the weekend came just as the sun was setting. I tried to use my debit card for a simple grocery run, only to have it declined. I checked my banking app. Account frozen pending legal guardianship proceeding. Cyprian had moved fast, using the psychiatrist's preliminary report to lock me out of my own life. I checked the hidden compartment in my bag. I had exactly $200 in cash. I had 48 hours until the 30th anniversary party. I was broke, my reputation was in tatters, and my own parents were trying to sell me like a piece of livestock. Most people would have crumbled, but as I sat on the floor of my darkened living room, I felt a strange, quiet power. They thought they had cut off my air, but they forgot I've been practicing how to breathe underwater for years. I wasn't just ready for the party, I was ready for the reckoning. The grand ballroom of the Greenwich mansion was a cathedral of curated lies. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured amber light over the elite crowd, while the scent of thousands of white lilies, the same cloying perfume from a week ago, hung like a heavy shroud in the air. I stood at the edge of the room, my hand steady on the velvet curtain. I wore a sharp, charcoal silk dress that felt less like an outfit and more like armor. I wasn't there as Astrid, the invisible daughter. I was there as the auditor of their downfall. The hum of high society chatter drifted toward me, trivial joys of lives untouched by the rot I had uncovered. Zinnia and Cyprian were at the center of it all, bathed in a spotlight of performative perfection. They clinked glasses, accepting toasts to 30 years of an enduring bond that was actually built on the bones of my identity. Zinnia spotted me and glided over, her smile as rigid as a porcelain mask. She pulled me into a tight, suffocating hug for the photographers, her perfume burning my throat. "Behave yourself, Astrid," she hissed into my ear, her grip bruising my arm. "The doctors will be waiting for you in the morning. Don't make this more difficult than it already is." I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I looked into her eyes that had watched me since infancy and still failed to recognize the woman I had become. "I truly hoped it would never come to this, Mom," I said, my voice a soft, steady rasp that made her smile falter for a fraction of a second. "I wanted to love the version of you that didn't exist." I offered that one final moment of grace, a quiet salute to the mother I should have had, before I stepped into the light to destroy the one I actually had. A lie may run 1,000 miles, but the truth catches up in a single step. The music died down with a practiced fade. Cyprian tapped his crystal glass, the sound ringing through the ballroom like a gavel. "And now," he announced, his voice booming with the hollow authority of a man who owned the room but possessed no soul. "My youngest daughter has a special tribute for this milestone." The crowd turned. Hundreds of eyes, curious and judgmental, focused on me. Zinnia's gaze was greedy. She expected the diamond necklace she had demanded as the price for my insanity. She thought she was about to receive a tribute. She didn't realize she was about to receive a subpoena. I walked toward the stage, the accountability box held firmly in my hands. The weight of it was a comfort now. A physical manifestation of every hour I had spent breathing underwater while they tried to drown me. I reached the podium and looked out at the faces of Greenwich's elite, the people my parents had used as a shield for decades. 30 years is a long time to maintain a foundation, I began, my voice clear and projecting to the very back of the hall. But a house is only as strong as the truth it's built on. I handed the box to Zinnia. Her fingers, adorned with rings bought with my stolen trust, tore at the ribbon with a desperate hunger. She opened the lid, expecting the cold fire of gemstones. Instead, she found the cold steel of notarized statements, bank records, and the formal repayment demand. I watched the blood drain from her face, her skin turning the color of old parchment. She looked up at me, her mouth opening in a silent, jagged gasp. These weren't just papers, they were the blueprints of their crimes. Before Cyprian could reach the stage to intervene, I triggered the ballroom's AV system with the remote in my palm. The massive screens behind the stage, meant for a nostalgic slideshow of family vacations, flickered to life. The room went deafeningly silent. The first image wasn't a beach in Maui. It was a high-resolution photo of the pinhole camera lens hidden in my molding. Then came the audio. The recording of Zinnia and Cyprian discussing the chemical sedatives they were slipping into my tea. Finally, the fake death certificate appeared, my name listed alongside a date of death while I stood right there in front of them, breathing and whole. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. I watched the realization ripple through the crowd like a shockwave. My parents' shadow was burning, and the tree of my integrity was the only thing left standing in the light. "You told everyone I was losing my mind?" I said, my voice echoing through the sterile hush of the ballroom. "But the only thing I've lost is my willingness to finance your lies. You didn't just steal my money. You tried to erase my existence." The elite of Greenwich, the very people they had tried to impress, were now witnesses to the raw, documented reality of the family's corruption. Cyprian finally broke the paralysis, rushing the podium, his face contorted into a mask of patriarchal rage. "This is a fabrication! A mental breakdown!" he shouted, but his voice sounded small and brittle against the backdrop of the evidence playing on the screen. I didn't back down. I pulled a final document from my dress pocket, a court-ordered subpoena for a full forensic audit. "The accountability gift is a choice, Father," I said, looking at him with a profound, final detachment. "Under Connecticut statutes regarding identity theft and financial exploitation, you have exactly 48 hours to return every stolen cent, or this entire file moves from these screens to the district attorney's office. Your bank accounts are no longer just frozen, they are under my control as your primary creditor." I wasn't seeking revenge. I was reclaiming the ownership of my life. Setting a boundary isn't a lack of love, it's the ultimate respect for the truth. I had finally separated my identity from their dysfunction. I was no longer a pawn, a bargaining chip, or a ghost. I was Astrid Vesper, the woman who had survived them. I watched Zinnia collapse into a gilded chair, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. She looked at me not with love, but with a sudden, naked fear. She understood then what Cyprian hadn't, that I wasn't bluffing and I wasn't emotional. I was an auditor, and the books were finally being closed. Just as the first whispers of scandal began to bubble up from the guests, the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion swung open. The sound echoed through the ballroom, drawing every eye away from the stage. 2 uniformed officers and a man in a sharp, dark suit entered the room, their presence a cold intrusion of the law into our private theater. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at Zinnia. They walked with a grim, purposeful stride, straight toward the buffet table, where my brother Lazarus stood, a half-eaten appetizer in his hand, and a look of dawning terror on his face. The dominoes I had spent months lining up finally began to fall, and the first one was the person they had destroyed my life to protect. The click of silver handcuffs against Lazarus's wrists was a sharp, clinical sound that finally cut through the cloying scent of lilies and lies. I stood in the grand foyer, my shadow long and steady against the marble floor, as federal agents led my brother toward the door. He didn't look like the family's golden investment anymore. He looked like a man who had finally run out of other people's lives to burn. The anniversary guests stood in frozen clusters, their whispers dying in their throats as the law finally entered the room we had spent 30 years pretending was a sanctuary. I stepped forward as Zinnia let out a jagged, performative scream, clutching at Cyprian's arm. "Astrid, you're destroying this family!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I didn't flinch. I looked at Lazarus, whose face had collapsed into a mask of dawning terror. I had turned over every stone in the accountability file to the FBI, every wire fraud, every money laundering scheme he had run using the business accounts my father had opened in my name. "I wasn't the one who put him in those chains, Lazarus. Your choices were the blacksmith. I'm just the one who turned on the lights." Cyprian looked at me, his eyes hollow and old. The patriarchal mask finally shattered. I reached into my bag and pulled out a business card for a reputable public defender. I handed it to him with a steady hand. I did it not because I supported my brother's crimes, but because I believed in a fair trial, a dignity they had never afforded me. Compassion isn't about ignoring the crime. It's about not becoming a monster to defeat one. I was done being their victim, but I refused to become their executioner. I was simply the auditor, and the audit was complete. The house grew silent after the sirens faded into the distance. The grand ballroom was a wreckage of half-eaten appetizers and abandoned champagne flutes. I stood in the foyer, the air finally clear of the cloying floral scent. I produced the final notarized deed from my briefcase, the one I had secured by purchasing their private debts and proving the trust fund theft. Since I was now their primary creditor, the ownership of the Greenwich mansion had legally reverted to me. I was no longer a guest. I was the owner. I handed the notice to quit to my father. They had 24 hours to vacate the property they had stolen from my future. Cyprian's hands shook as he took the paper, his voice a pathetic rasp as he begged for one more chance. I remained unmoved. Giving a second chance to someone who hasn't admitted to the first mistake is just participating in your own destruction. I had already secured a modest 2-bedroom apartment for them in a different state, a place far from the high society they had used to mask their rot. It was more than they deserved, but it was exactly what my conscience required. Zinnia wept over her lost status, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves against the mahogany floor. I leaned in, my voice a soft, final whisper that only she could hear. You spent 30 years building a house of cards and expected me to be the glue, Mom. I'm just a woman who decided to finally let the wind blow. The message was clear. Accountability is the only way to find the truth of who we are. I walked away from her, the sound of my own heels the only rhythm that mattered now. I was finally free of the gravity of their dysfunction. A week later, the morning sun broke through the ancient oaks of my grandmother's quiet garden. I sat on a stone bench, the air smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. The house in Greenwich was being liquidated to settle the repayment demands, and the trust was finally being restored to its original purpose. I felt a profound, quiet power in the stillness. Success is not the best revenge. Living a life that requires no revenge at all is the true victory. I had secured my credit, my name, and my grandmother's legacy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the family heirloom watch, the one Cyprian had given me to keep me in line. I placed it in a small box, ready to be donated to a charity for victims of financial abuse. It was a heavy piece of gold, but it felt weightless as I let it go. Sometimes, closure doesn't come from a conversation or an apology. It comes from the quiet act of walking away. I looked out at the horizon, the light caught in the dew on the grass, and I felt a smile touch my lips. A real one this time. Family isn't defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the respect that flows through your actions. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the ghost on a death certificate. I was a woman who owned her life, her choices, and her peace. I know many of you have stood in rooms where your voice was ignored and your value was erased. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand to save your own soul? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one. We find our strength in the truths we refuse to let them bury.